And trust really holds any smart water project together, really any personal relationship. And we really saw that this wasn't covered enough in the smart water sector. So SWAN teamed up with the Cleveland Water Alliance to bring you today's webinar. I'm Amir Khan, SWAN's executive director. And SWAN is the leading global hub for the smart water sector. You can see we bring together the entire ecosystem. This webinar is being hosted by the SWAN Americas Alliance. And the SWAN Americas Alliance accelerates smart water in North and South America by bringing together leading members in the region through member collaboration. And I want to also invite Max from Cleveland Water Alliance to give a brief background about their alliance.
Thanks so much, Amir. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. I'm Max Herzog. I'm a program manager with Cleveland Water Alliance. We're a water innovation hub based in the Great Lakes region of the United States. And our focus is really on how we can accelerate water innovation and technology across our region, bringing innovations from across the world to our space, and creating solutions that can have impact across the world. We have a world-class set of testbed infrastructure in the region to pilot new sensing and innovation technologies, and we're working right now to create a seed fund to invest in water technology. So if you're interested in partnering on accelerating innovative water technology, we're always here to do that, and we're excited to facilitate or co-convene this conversation with SWAN.
Yeah, thanks, Max. And I want to start off with an exciting announcement. The next SWAN Americas workshop will be held in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in late September. And we're going to partner with Badger Meter and MMSD. So stay tuned. You'll get more details coming soon. And we encourage you to register for SWAN's flagship event, our annual conference, taking place May 9th to 11th in Glasgow, Scotland. The theme is Making Smart Water Mainstream. You can learn more at this URL. And it's a great opportunity to really network with global SWAN members. And with that, I wanted to introduce today's moderator, Luis, who is a principal at HydroDigital LLC, a consulting company helping utilities adopt digital solutions for managing the urban water cycle. A recognized water innovator, advocate, and entrepreneur, he has led the development and commercialization of one of the world's first smart sewer technologies, a game-changing AI-fueled wastewater optimization solution that is currently being applied in more than 40 cities around the world. So welcome, Luis. I'll let you introduce the panelists.
Well, thank you, Amir, and thank you, Max. First of all, I wanted to thank everyone for being here and to listen to our panelists and discuss the role of trust in the adoption of digital technologies. Today, we're going to be talking about how trust affects the change management process that involves people, process, and technology. We're going to be putting a special emphasis on the people and process part. In particular, we want to talk about how the role of trust in the digital transformation of utilities, how it is built, who are the stakeholders, but also what is the right level of trust to balance, for example, innovation with security, like when we're talking about cybersecurity, for example, and how it affects the contracting mechanisms between utilities, consultants, and technology providers. We can probably talk for hours or even days about this topic, but we want to make sure we hear your comments and questions. So we'll have a short discussion with our panelists, and then we'll open it to Q&A. So please stay tuned. We have an excellent group of panelists with us. Let me introduce them to you. We have Sahil Chaini. He's a water industry and client success professional, bringing together 7 years of software as a service experience with 6 years of water education at McGill and Duke University. She's passionate about the intersection of technology and water infrastructure. Currently, Sahil leads the customer success at Transcend. Transcend's mission is to transform the way asset owners, technology suppliers, and engineering firms assess and design critical infrastructure. The Transcend Design Generator is an intuitive online generative design platform that enables planners, developers, and engineers to rapidly generate preliminary engineering designs for critical infrastructure. Sahil is working with utilities engineering firms and equipment suppliers in these sectors to create an ecosystem that drives innovation and improved outcomes. We have Sarah Parker. Sarah works for the National American Water Service team as part of the Operational Excellence team, primarily as a project manager, water quality and environmental excellence. With 6,400 dedicated professionals, American Water is the largest and most geographically diverse U.S. publicly traded water and wastewater utility company, providing drinking water and wastewater services to an estimated 14 million people in 24 states. Sarah is responsible in various roles for rolling out enterprise-wide applications and initiatives like the lead and copper planning and operation improvements. She's also a product owner and a change management leader for the commercial and contracted enterprise web applications. Through the diverse roles that she's held, Sarah's passion remains in connecting people from treatment to tap across the enterprise, including customers, executives, and operators alike. And then we have Steve Green, who is the digital water practice leader at Stanley Consultants. Steve has spent his 23-year career in business development and project delivery roles in the water industry, helping water system owners improve their infrastructure via technology adoption and collaborative project delivery. Steve holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Bioresources Engineering from Montana State University and an MBA from the University of Washington. Founded in 1913, Stanley Consultants is a member-owned engineering firm with a rich history of helping clients across the globe solve complex water challenges. They have members in more than 24 offices worldwide and have worked in all 50 states and more than 120 countries. They're building the water systems of the future with digital solutions to ongoing challenges by leveraging partnerships with technology providers to break through data silos and create the water utilities of the future. So the great thing is that we have represented on our panelists both utility side, we have a technology provider and a consultant to help us round this, this conversation. As Amir was pointing out, trust is a key component in adoption of digital technologies. And this obviously stems from a number of different factors. For example, digital solutions break down data silos as information needs to be collected and used by different departments and stakeholders. Trust is needed to make everyone comfortable sharing and using the data. Yet another example, design automation, real-time decision support systems optimize design and operation of critical infrastructure. There, trust is needed between technology providers, consultants, and operators to reduce anxiety that technology, for example, will take on people's job instead of augmenting it. So we're going to start with our first round of 2 rounds of questions here. And the first question is, in your experience, have you seen trust play the biggest role? Where have you seen trust play the biggest role in digital adoption? And what is your recommendation on building that trust? And to get us started with that, we're going to have Sarah, who's representing and leading that change within American Water, a large, one of the largest water providers in the United States and the world. So Sarah.
Thanks, Luis, for giving me the first go around. So at American Water, we're a rather large company and we have challenges like small companies too. They're just different, right? So organizationally speaking, I'd say we tend to use more of a top-down approach, especially when we introduce a new process change. We really need the emphasis from the higher ups within that organization to help push their employees to really see the value behind the new process we're changing and what we're ultimately working towards. Additionally, though, we also work a bottom-up approach and not just top-down. So once we get the tops buy-in, we tend to work bottom-up with more of the frontline employees and just engaging them, making sure that they're happy because they're also our customer just as much as their managers are. In my experience, I do feel as though the bottom-up approach does tend to work better, just because if you're happy, your boss is happy, and then their boss is happy too, right? So it tends to work better for our end goals to engage the frontline employees who are utilizing the product on a day-to-day basis and ultimately keep them happy. As a company overall, we're really striving to engage more and have more ownership, and not just of ownership of your department and what you're responsible for, but ownership overall, right? So water quality is everyone's job. Water quality isn't just someone who's making sure we maintain compliance's job. It's everyone's job, because if that main breaks, everyone is responsible, and it's a team effort to make sure the main is properly fixed, as well as the water quality is maintained after the main break is resolved. We are American Water, we strive for safety, but in my eyes, water quality is customer safety, right? So as important as it is that we go home every day to our families just the way we left to go to work, it's equally important that our customers don't have to worry about what comes out of their tap, or the safety of what they're drinking or what their children are drinking either. Again, though, we engage our end users a lot. So as you can imagine, we have many end users of all of our applications, right? Internal and external. We have a lot of, not risk, but we have a lot of conversations around their suggestions. So as much as we'd love to do every single employee's suggestion, it just doesn't always happen. So we tend to have a team who collaborate together in order to determine what the best bang for your buck, so to speak, is. And when we talk about that, we always consider the how much effort it takes, but also that regulatory risk. If one state has a high regulatory risk regarding an enhancement request, that's going to get done, because our regulatory compliance is also our number one, because that's going to keep our customers safe at the end of the day. So that's kind of American Water from a large utilities perspective of the approach we take when it comes to building the trust of our employees and our customers.
I love your quote that water quality is everyone's job, and especially how do you map that back to one of the company's core tenets, which is safety and risk avoidance, right? Like many times utilities are risk averse, but you are mapping that safety and regulatory risk to making water quality everyone's job, and through that process being able to drive that innovation. That's fantastic. Let's move over to Sahil. From your perspective on working with consultants and working with utilities as a technology provider, how do you go about developing that trust in having this design automation systems help engineers design critical infrastructure?
Thanks, Luis. I will say it definitely helps for us to have folks like Sarah and Steve on their teams who really drive this initiative internally. We've seen, in terms of trust initially, of course, to be able to acquire any software, you're building a lot of trust at the top, right? They're the ones doing the procurement and evaluating the business value. But really, I think the long road that pretty much determines the success of that technology and the digital transformation it can drive is, does it actually provide value to the people using the software, and how can we enable them? One of the things with trust is, I think we all can acknowledge, is that it takes time, especially we sell software, and it takes time to build that trust with engineers to say, yes, this, matches your requirements, it actually will help you do your job. And we need to not just say it, but they need to see it on their end. And we spend a lot of time with them, listening to their feedback. We do very similar exercises to what Sarah just said. We're not gonna be able to do everything all at once. So what is the most important? What's going to be the biggest impact on their workflow, their time savings? A lot of software is really a lot about time saving. And so what is going to help them the most? And weighing the pros and cons, and the customers that get the most value are the ones where internally they're very, they have those conversations and say, what will help us the most, right? And when they're aligned and, they build trust within the organization, when they come to us and say, hey, here's changes we need to make to the software, here's what will make it better for us, then it makes, of course, our job easier because they've already prioritized what makes the most sense for them. So I do think, I always say, everyone says, how can we use software to differentiate ourselves? I think the biggest factor is not just adopting it, but also making it as part of the workflow. It's probably the single biggest thing and biggest hurdle for all sides, I think, for consultants, for technology suppliers, and for utilities.
That's fantastic. That's something that you don't get to hear very often, how the ability to develop trust is actually part of a technology provider's key differentiator. And I also love the point that you make about, when you have people like Sarah, right? When you have alignment, you're seeking that cultural alignment between how do you think about the world, building, optimizing, how do you actually build this infrastructure, and those who seek to actually achieve those objectives as well. And then switching to Steve. Steve, from your role as a consultant that is helping utilities, sort of wander through this digital journey, how do you advise utilities to build trust within themselves and also with the technology providers?
Yeah, sure. Great question, Louis. Thank you. So yeah, as a consultant, right, we're often in the kind of center seat of the discussion, right, of the implementation. So you've got a software or technology provider, or you've got a utility. The consultant is asked to facilitate and deliver, right, that change, that project from the current state, right, to the future state. There's kind of two different ways that we're doing that, right? One side is design data, design methodologies. That process is pretty traditional, pretty established. So in that role, right, we're taking data about our customers' facilities, about the regulatory requirements, their production goals, efficiency goals, right? Things like that tend to be publicly available knowledge. So we're taking that in. We're utilizing software such as Transcend, where we plug that data in. As a consultant, we use that sort of software, right, to leverage, to deliver better work products, projects to our customers. And so the trust there is pretty well established. Now contrast that, right, to what we do if it's operational technology, very different, right? This is where the specifics of the utilities, safety, compliance, chemical dosing, right? A lot of very sensitive information. These newer, software technologies, a lot of these sit in the cloud, right? And so you've got this sensitive data that is going out of a utility into a cloud profile, right? And then you've got a software company that is, applying their data science to that data, right? Bringing that back to the utility. And so there's, that opens up some risk there where that data transfers out of the utility to the cloud, goes to this provider, comes back. So as a consultant, right, we are auditing, looking at the way that data flows, looking at the tech provider, comprehending what cloud provider they utilize. Typically we find credible folks are using large providers, Amazon's, Microsoft's, right, folks like that. They every day, right, they have people trying to breach them as contractors, right? And so they're staying very abreast cybersecurity, right? Making sure they're very invulnerable, right, to those sort of attacks. So we look at and make sure that sort of thing is happening. And then from there, once we're convinced we have a partner that's well protected, we have that data protected with appropriate firewalls, et cetera. And by the way, right, these technologies, there's always a gap of sorts where the data goes out, it's processed, it comes back with a recommendation, but not a control. And so there's always still an operator, right, that has a separated firewalled SCADA system that actually makes these changes. That's very key, right? We're not working with providers, right, that have direct control because we're just not there, right? That we're not secure in that way. And then from there, it kind of, I think, ties back to what the other panelists, Sahil and Sarah, said. It's a process of consensus building. So, as a consultant, we tend to do like a workshop approach. We like to get the operators together. We'll have a session, we'll call sort of a grudge and hope session. We'll get the operators together and say, what are all your grudges, right? With the current situation, let's get that on paper. Let's make sure everybody's voice is heard. And then we'll say, okay, let's hear what your hopes are, right? What do you hope this new system can do for you? On top of that, right, we're gonna layer the economic goals of the project, the leadership goals, the culture goals, et cetera. Synthesize that together. That's what becomes the project definition. And then as you go through the implementation process, your eyes, circling back, right? Making sure, hey, are we true to this definition, to these goals of the project delivery?
Very interesting. I love that grudge and hope workshop. And this is something that we heard from Sarah and Sahil as well, how important it is to listen to your end users, and is building consensus from the bottom up is extremely important for this kind of adoption. Without providing that safe place for people to actually voice their concerns, even if they cannot be acted upon, that can be extremely useful. But one other takeaway that I got from you, Steve, is that there isn't a one size fits all, right? And we actually have a question from the audience on this regard between small and larger utilities. Thank you, Monk, for the question. Please, everyone else, please keep them coming. We'll be addressing these questions here in a minute. Now, there is a saying that says innovation moves at the speed of trust. But is it possible that there's too much trust? Is it possible that a utility, for example, trusts too much a technology provider, whereby you actually hamper innovation, or you can actually get into dangerous places? What is the right level of trust? How do you actually translate that to contracts between utility and technology providers or service providers? Some of the things that come to mind, for example, are cybersecurity. So let's stick with you, Steve, and give us your thoughts on, is there a thing as too much trust, and how we manage this contractually?
Yeah, absolutely. Very good question, Luis. So I would say definitely there is the potential of too much trust. I think the classic, story you hear about is the new software system that somebody says, hey, we have all these promises. A utility says, yes, let's do that. And then somewhere in that implementation process, there's a failure. So the promises were made, but the team, right, the operations team didn't adopt it. So you spent the money, you've put the time into it, but you've kind of failed to get those goals. So I think the process you go through to make sure that doesn't happen is looking at providers that have, proven case studies, utilities they've worked with. You can talk to, get a sense of what they have accomplished, how they went through that process to succeed in that delivery. And we don't want to stifle innovation. And so sometimes there's going to be a new tech where there's not a good case study. And then you just look at it like, hey, how do we do a proof of concept, right? How do we do a pilot? Take a low risk, bite-sized chunk that can prove if you can get the results that are being promised. Then from there, sort of scale it up. What Stanley's done is we've actually looked at about 300 different providers that, have the potential to bring value to our utility partners. We work with a shorter group of those, but we're always, maintaining our awareness of what's out there. And so there's, larger utilities might have more staff internally, and they can go through that process and see who's out there. We try to help those that don't have that sort of resources in-house to, kind of shortcut that process with some of the due diligence that we've done. Then from there, right, it's that step of what are the project goals? What are the case studies? Is it proven? Get that buy-in bottoms up and go through that process.
That's great, Steve. There's a lot of talk about how do we standardize certain things, contracts and the methods of engagement, because there are people are saying the technology works as not adopt where the intake is too slow. Would love to get Sahil's thoughts on this. How have you seen that adoption pace going on? Have you seen a situation where it is good practices on how utilities can develop contracts by which that trust gets to be moderated in a way that is helpful for both?
Absolutely, Luis. I think Steve hit the nail on the head with the very much like starting with smaller scope and increasing as you go. I think that is probably the key thing in building trust. We work with US as well as global utilities, and they all have varying levels of internal resources. So I think the way sort of contractually we've started is we have kind of a step up approach. So the more and more value you're getting, the more adoption you get, the sort of that's how you would up not just features, but the value and the costs, so that you're not starting with a big chunk up front. So I think really doing that, we did that with Stanley. We started, Stanley really wanted to see how Transcend could work and kind of figure out all the use cases. And really, I think once you have a good baseline of adoption, then it's much easier to scale from there with increasing that that usage, as well as, broadly using that software. Other things I think I would always recommend are almost all software companies should provide like some sort of support commitment within your contract. So, either in hours or outcomes, I think that's really important. And that really helps. I'm on the customer success side, so we look at that all the time. And, that's our commitment to the customer to say, if this is what is, we've promised this in the contract, and, if we aren't able to deliver for any reason, there's sort of other ways we need to be providing value and have that trust with the customer. But ideally that holds us accountable, right? And the utility knows what to expect, to say, okay, you know what, we have this many hours from them, or this is the type of support we can expect. That also actually helps them. Can you remember, Luis, having that safe space to actually reach out? I don't know if there's technology suppliers in the audience, but you probably know you're like constantly asking. It's like, hey, do you have feedback? What do you think? And sometimes they don't necessarily speak up until you've actually built that trust. And that way you don't know where you're at. Is it actually solving a problem that they're having? How can we do better? So in terms of having too much trust, it is there if you don't hold the other person accountable. So we hold our customers accountable to say, like, you have to use the software. We want you to get value, and we really push them to do that digital transformation. It is uncomfortable, right? It always is. And so we kind of all support each other through that discomfort. But I think the opposite is also very true, where they also need to keep us accountable to make sure we continuously improve and are actually meeting their goals. It's not a buy it and forget it situation. I think that happens sometimes, gets lost in the busyness of everything that utilities do. And so I would say it's too much trust, but in a way it is. So you're just like, all right, it's working. Pretty sure it's working. This is more important here. Sarah's smiling. But I think that way, because it is money that you're spending. And I think it's on both sides to make sure that that communication's there to say, are we delivering on what we promised, and let us know what we can do better.
Very cool. So, if there's too much trust, then the relationships becomes, the relationship between the technology provider and the utility becomes lazy, right? And the feedback stops coming, which actually doesn't help the technology provider, because at the end, you want to make sure that you're delivering value. So the other takeaway that I have is it just takes effort, right, to go through that process. And moving on to Sarah now, from the utility perspective, how do you contractually manage? How do you put that element of trust when you are looking at contracts with technology providers? And I'm particularly interested because American Water is huge, right? So you need to scale this in a way that that needs to be accelerated, right? So how do you manage this, Sarah?
Yeah, so typically when American Water decides we're going to roll something out or purchase a product, software as a service, typically, we start with a pilot. In a couple of locations, we try to use, since we have so many different sources, either surface water, groundwater, purchased water, we try to use a couple different locations. So it doesn't just work for groundwater or just purchased water. And then once we get past the pilot and we've agreed to, we like the service, our users are happy, and then we tend to go through a technical committee hearing. So we go, I usually am not involved in it, but I've heard of them. So they'll go through and get documents for how much time it's going to save, what the financial benefits are on American Water's side across the business. So whether that is getting rid of paper, whether that's making water quality happy because they have a better idea of how the plant is operating, what the granular impact is at the end of the day, that once that gets approved, then we sign a scope of work with that vendor, whomever that is for that product. And again, that typically includes what we're hoping to accomplish within that year. So Sahil mentioned support hours. We usually have that in our SOWs, but we also have improvements too. We like to Americanize things. That's a verb I made up, but we have American Water has our own way of doing things, and we are unique in and of itself that we are such a large privately owned utility company, right? So we have our own ins and outs, and we have our own internal products that we utilize to manage those and within our own connections. So there are different ways we need to use an existing product to make our existing processes even better. So where do we get down to breaking trust? I think trust is a two-way street, right? So the biggest thing with our technology vendors is we need them to be able to integrate with us. And if they can't or they're unwilling, that tends to break that immediately, right? So we want that product to work with what we have because we've continued to invest so much time and effort into what we have today. And at the end of the day, we don't want our end users to have to learn a new method either, right? So they know if we need to store data about this public water supply, we go here. We don't want them to have to relearn something they're very comfortable and confident in. So as long as they're willing to work with that, that always sets us in the right path. But at the end of the day, we really like to collaborate with our technology partners. We want them to call us out on something that might be absurd but we also want them to do it too. If we have a request that is a regulatory risk and we have a lot of customers who keep bringing it up, we need them to, even though it might cost more money or take something else out of that scope of work for the year, we need them to be willing to accomplish that for our end users too, because they're the people using that product and we want them happy. So if that trust doesn't go both ways, it does tend to take a hit on that product and our hope for it.
That is fantastic. You guys clearly have an entire process already developed to manage how do you adopt these technologies, how do you build that trust between all the stakeholders. If we stick with you for just one of the questions from Umang is how important it is for small utilities to adapt digitalization because their problems seem somehow different than those of bigger utilities in terms of resources like budget and time. I would say process as well, right? Like just structured process. A utility that is very small, municipal owned or a rural utility would definitely have less resources, less budget, and most likely no process to adopt these some of these technologies. If you were going to sit on their shoes, what would you recommend?
I think the biggest challenge, like you said, it's going to be resources, but the regulatory drive tends to be the biggest thing, at least within our sub-American waters, like Illinois American Water, Indiana American Water. A lot of these regulators are pushing towards electronic submittals. So I think, yes, you could use Excel, Microsoft Excel, and input data and then send that off to your regulator, right? But that's not going to be very easy to export either. So in a case where you have years of data, we have a lot of engineering projects. Now we're getting into the lead and copper revised rule, right? Coming at the end of 2023, I think, 2023, 2024. You need to have something other than paper. I couldn't possibly imagine, even in our rural utility company, going through and looking at tap cards to look at your service inventory. It's so simple to sit. We have all of that managed electronically. You can search all your lead service lines, and now you know where your service lines are at and where you need to focus your efforts to replace those within the next 10 years. So I think time is the big thing. It's going to take a lot of time to manage the change management, but in the next 2-3 years, the value there is, you can't even put a number on it. The value to be able to export 5 years worth of data for an engineering study, if engineers, or if the state says we need a higher chlorine residual, to be able to provide that to the engineering group and say, hey, we need to loop the system at this dead end. There's just a lot of value there. So I think trying to scrutinize time, the time of your employees today too. How many hours a week does someone spend inputting numbers into Excel so you can generate an MOR? Okay, well, we can put numbers behind that. And once we put numbers behind that, to be able to do that with the click of a button to download a report that saved X amount of time, 10 hours a month, that adds up pretty quick. So that's the one thing I would suggest focusing on. Again, we are a large utility, so we have more resources available, but I think there's a lot of real use situations where it'd be so nice to be able to just click a button.
So you see applications everywhere, and it sounds like, you know, the advice is sharpen your axe. If you're gonna go through this process, you better figure out where is it that you're spending your time and try to optimize it. It reminds me also what Sahil, you mentioned before, in looking for utilities where there's alignment in the terms of, you know, figuring out how they can optimize their time use for, in your case, designing new infrastructure. What is your thought? Do you see these kind of tools and the process, so the technology and the process of building trust different? Have you experienced that being differently between a very large utility and some of the smaller ones? What have you been able to observe?
For sure. I think the thing I always say is start simple. I would say, I think even if it's a smaller utility, you have the key pain points that you're trying to solve. I would start there. And because a lot of times you don't start with the software to be like, oh, I want the software, and then be like, okay, what problem does it solve? I would start the opposite of like, what are the things that are really holding you back? What are the biggest challenges? And what will make the biggest impact? And then find software to solve those problems. So for us, we've had utility customers that they weren't the one using the software because they didn't have the resources in terms of design engineers and that they could spend time, but they essentially got the consulting firms that they work with to say, hey, can you use the software for these projects? Because we then have longer we have visibility across different projects, different timelines. It kind of acts like a digital twin for us. So they can also collaborate with their partners to say, here's a problem we're having, here's a solution we found, can you help us? And I think from our experience, most of the consulting firms are happy to, of course, help. But I do think starting with the problem and say, hey, we want to have more options to be prepared for uncertainty, which is pretty much every water utility right now. We have a lot of industries coming in. We need to be able to plan for that, whatever that like upcoming either regulatory or situational items are. Like some places are getting like unprecedented population growth, even some smaller places that they haven't prepared for that in previous master plans. So I think I would say start with, as a smaller company, you really have to focus your resources on the things that hurt you the most, right? So start with that, and then you can guarantee you can find software to help you solve that, whether you're internally or you get your supply chain to use it, and then they can support you on that.
Prioritizing, absolutely, yes. I think even the larger utilities probably have, have the discipline on prioritizing where they're going to be spending time. Let's switch to another question here. In what ways is the role of the consultant changing as the technology providers evolve in their offering to water utilities? And this question, I think it is perfect for Steve. Steve, you have seen this in this environment. It's becoming more and more difficult to call consultants just consultants and technology providers just technology providers, as sort of the lines are blurring in between. Do you see that affecting how utilities can develop the trust needed to adopt these digital technologies, or do you see that as hampering actually how these teams work together?
Yeah, good question. So I think traditionally in the industry, the delivery of technology has mostly been what I would call design, bid, build. So you have a consultant that sort of develops like, what is the challenge? What is the solution? Coming up with a bid package to the providers. Then there's this procurement process. You pick, it might be based off of price. It might be based off of qualifications, some sort of hybrid of those. Then you implement it. But, all across the industry, I think there's a transition to what I would call collaborative delivery, where, you have a clearer picture perhaps of, this is my challenge. This is the potential value of the technology. This is how I get those together to solve that. And so you have the opportunity to go both ways. And I think it's a case by case decision that should be made. Is it more appropriate to bid this, or is it more appropriate to do some sort of collaborative approach? Advantages, disadvantages. I think collaborative, you can get the technology more quickly. You can focus on qualifications. The flip side is if it's something that's very, very proven out with multiple providers, the bidding approach, can actually get you a great value because there's multiple people that can help you solve that problem. So much of like we've been talking about here today, it's very custom, a small utility, what they need is very different than a big utility. How you deliver it is very different, depending on what the solution is, what the problem it solves is. So I would just basically say, approach it with this thought process of, how do I get the right tech and how do I deliver it? And then, go down that path.
That's great. That on itself, like how do you actually most effectively procure these digital solutions? That's another webinar on itself, right? Like we can probably put something entirely together just on that topic. We have another question here. We're gonna make a quick round. The question reads, roughly how long do these pilots run before rolling out a project, right? I'm sure that the answer is going to be somewhere like it depends, but we're going to do a quick round because we have a few additional questions here that are coming. So just give us a range. Steve, what is your range for what a reasonable time for a pilot is before a rollout?
Sure. So I think like a basic digital delivery, a sensor and a dashboard, you could prove that out in a month or two. Something that is more based off of like AI, right, where you need to accumulate data so you can apply data science. You're going to have, 6 months of data before that AI tool can actually be effective. So then you're talking about something that's maybe 9 to 12 months. So there's a range.
Great. 1 month to a year. Let's go with Sahil. What do you think?
I'm always a 6 to 12 months. I don't like much shorter than that just because there's no way you're going to achieve, especially get enough people using it and feeling it in their day-to-day. Like I said, the business process changes a lot. So my favorites are 1 year because I think it gives everybody enough time to truly feel it out and start getting ready to implement it.
All right, 1 year. Sarah, what do you think?
I think, again, I agree with Steve. It depends on what you're rolling out. I think if it's a rollout more regulatory based, I think it might be dependent on your timeline when you have to have that changed for regulatory purposes. So you might have a shorter pilot versus a longer one. I would say we probably try to stick out like between 6 and 8 months at a couple locations prior to starting actively roll out throughout the enterprise.
Cool, excellent. That makes a lot of sense. We are going to stick with you for the next question, Sarah. It reads from David Rubenstein. Thank you, David, for the question. Does anyone have experience utilizing proven change management program? This is a very common approach in traditional business applications like CRM, ERP, PLM, align people, process, and technology. Do you guys at American Water utilize, some of these proven programs or textbook programs or standard methodologies, or do you develop your own?
I don't think we have like more of a structured program that we utilize. A lot of our IT project managers hold their PMP licenses. I do not have mine, but I do know a lot of people that do within American Water. As far as the change management side, though, I don't think we have a formalized process to utilize that. So it's definitely something to look into. I know we're all in the world of digitalizing your business as much as you can. So there's a lot of change management that goes along with it. So it's definitely something to bring back to our team and think about. Thanks, David.
Great. Yeah, I mean, it seems like, there is so much to be learned on this aspect, right? So much to absorb. But at the end, I guess is what works at the end. We have another question from Mark at Thank you, Mark. In my experience with other industries, software as a service is a much more effective approach to deliver software values. This is true in the water utility industry. Let's switch over to Sahil on this one. And in particular, one of the issues that I've heard with software as a service, you have obviously lots of years of experience with this, is for utilities is that path that Steve was mentioned for the data, right? Like it goes from our servers or our machines to the cloud. Who knows what happens there? Is it going to go through the internet, some unsecure network, so on and so forth? How have you seen that affect the process of commercializing your technology? Do you see the software as a service, which obviously allows you to upgrade the software continuously? Do you see that utilities have trust issues with the cloud and cybersecurity issues that hamper that process?
Short answer, yes, for sure. We see that with utilities. We work with equipment suppliers. I think the water industry in general, but I've also worked not in the water industry in SaaS. I think there is always going to be a bit of a risk, of course. I don't want to say there's no risk in having data in the cloud, but I think Steve, you mentioned, or Luis, like you use AWS. If you use sort of trusted applications, there's definitely a lot of remedial processes. There's also security certifications that a lot of SaaS companies do have. So being SOC 2 compliant, having those processes in place if something would happen. So as a utility, if you're going to procure software, there's a lot of things that you can look for and ask for from the software company to make sure that they have, lots of backup processes, essentially. So I think that's a big part of, in terms of the cybersecurity risk, that's definitely there. That's part of the building of trust, is how does that data get managed? And if a smaller utility isn't able to do that due diligence, Steve, it sounds like you guys kind of help with that too. So I feel like that's a big part of buying software that we probably don't talk about a lot, is that due diligence piece of making sure that the software that you're going to buy actually has all of those processes in place. I think that we try our best to convince people that we're not going to sell your data. We have an NDA in place, and a lot of that comes from, honestly, months of discussions and making sure that everyone feels comfortable. And there are also ways of creating processes. Like we do this with in Europe, where if your contact information, you can essentially have things be wiped out every certain period of time. So if there's a lot of sensitive information, you can start to think about, okay, how do we make it so that there's not a huge history, but we're still getting the value that we need. That's just an example, but there's a lot of ways, I think, to get around it. But I also don't think there's another option yet that we've come across that's better than storing things in the cloud. So I think we should, instead of shying away from it, let's think of how do we make it better, rather than saying, no, it has to be in this pen and paper or like this local computer that also has a lot of risk. If you can imagine what happens if that completely dies, or that person the only one person who knew how to use that is retired or left the company. So I think you kind of have to weigh your risks there.
That's great, Sahil. Thank you so much. We have two more questions before we finish our webinar. We have a question from Mark Custermans, and Sahil, you partially answered that question. It reads, how can cybersecurity measures be implemented and maintained to ensure the protection of sensitive water data while also allowing for efficient access and use by relevant stakeholders to drive value creation in the industry? And I'm going to lump this question with a question by Chris Sosnowski. Chris, thank you for your question. Chris is asking, can you comment on the criticism that while technology solves problems, it has also added too much complexity for the water industry? How do small and mid-sized utilities best deal with this complexity? And I'm going to throw this question at Steve, and going to somewhat lump it with the previous one, right? So we have all of these cybersecurity measures that can be implemented to making sure that data is secure. And then we have a lot of different features and things that a utility needs to be worried about when they are implementing these kind of solutions. What do you think about this criticism that Chris is mentioning, that it creates too much complexity for small to medium utilities? We've got 3 minutes to finish.
Yeah, okay, all right. So I'll be brief there. Very, very good question, right? Very complicated, sort of, combining that with cybersecurity. So here's what I would say is that what has happened with utilities, I think, is that there's a lot more, sensors, instrumentation, metering, right, that creates a lot more data, that the utility then has the data, but it's more difficult, right, to process, analyze, translate the data into information, right, which then you can take the information, make a better decision, et cetera. And so there's this kind of buzz phrase, right, is data rich, information poor. So I think at the core of that is the promise of digital, that, we're gonna apply some tools, right, that translate the data into information. The utility can then use that to make a better decision. And then you have to do that with cybersecurity in mind. So I think we've all been over that subject here today. There's, third parties that can vet these SaaS providers. There's ways to look at the chain of custody, essentially, of that data. A great analogy is online banking, right? So think 10 years ago, where you were with trust of online banking, but now it's very ubiquitous. You deposit checks and such. Well, that's a regulation, or that's an industry that is heavily regulated for safety and security by the government. Well, guess what? The water industry is going to be there too. So I think over time, as our cybersecurity comes up, the trust of these sort of tools is going to be inherent, so we can move faster. But right now, I think Chris, nailed it. Right, there is that issue, and that's just what it is, right? You got to get your trust, and you got to pick a roadmap and go through that process.
Excellent. So if we have an extra minute, would like to ask you, Steve, in a sentence or two, what is your key takeaway?
Yeah, there's a ton of value with digital water tech. So figure out where you are, what your challenges are, what it can potentially do for you, and then figure out, how do I evaluate it? How do I harness it? How do I apply it? It's imperative to get started, right? So just pick a place and get started, figure out who your partners are, and go.
Excellent. How about you, Sahil? Your key takeaway?
I would always say, this is the future. And I think it's, as I don't want to repeat what Steve said, but I do think it's important to get started and focus on what will be the most valuable to you and make the biggest impact on your business. And listen to the folks who are on the ground. They're going to be the ones who'll be able to really answer that question for you. And I think once you can unlock that, the amount of impact and growth you'll see from implementing these solutions and the digital transformation is going to pay back a lot more than you even thought.
How about you, Sarah?
Well, I don't want to say everything that Steve and Sahil said, but I would say find your why. Why are you doing this? And really focus on your why. It's a lot better to be ahead of the 8 ball than behind. So from your perspective, it's probably better to work with the technology providers, have more options, and have time to grow, so that way you can curate them into what you need from them, versus needing to electronify your forms and your submissions or whatever you need to give to your regulator, because at the end of the day, it's better to have time to work with them than not have time and need to do it ASAP. So it'd be much more beneficial for everyone that way, I think.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah. And with that, we'll conclude our webinar. Thank you so much, Sarah, Steve, Sahil, for being panelists. Special thanks to the SWAN and Amir's team, as well as the Cleveland Water Alliance and Max and his team for giving us the opportunity to actually discuss this topic. We can probably talk again for days on this, but it was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all so
Thank
much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks so much, all.
Bye.